Well, I have a great many hopes and dreams. I think in many ways, the language and culture revitalization work I've devoted my life to, and the diversity, equity, and inclusion work I've devoted my life to, you know, those sorts of efforts are feeding a broad dream of healing some of the greatest hurts that humans have visited upon one another. And I believe it is possible for us to obtain healing as individuals, communities, societies, and even nations. But it's going to take all of our collective effort to get there. As far as a message to Native people traveling in this world is a beautiful place. It's got dangerous parts too. But I think that travel, learning, reading, they are inimical to all of the oppressions that are out there. And I encourage people to do it. You learn so much from all the people that you bump into and all the learning opportunities that you get. Take advantage of every one of them. And it will not just help you see the world differently, it will transform you. And the transformation will be worth all the effort.
That's Anton Treuer, an American academic and author specializing in the Ojibwe language and culture. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jayson Blair. Anton Treuer is an American academic and author who specializes in the Ojibwe language and a 2008 Guggenheim Fellow. Anton has authored and edited more than 20 books and is the editor of the only academic journal about the Ojibwe language. Anton was born in Washington, D.C. to Robert and Margaret Treuer. His father was an Austrian Jew and a Holocaust survivor, and his mother was an enrolled member of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation, a federally recognized tribe that is one of 5 other member tribes of the Minnesota Chippewa. His mother had grown up on the Leech Lake Reservation. She was a tribal judge and the first female Native attorney in Minnesota. Anton grew up in and around the Leech Lake Reservation, and after high school went to Princeton University before obtaining his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1996. After working as an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Anton returned to his hometown of 3 Minnesota Chippewa reservations, Leech Lake, White Earth, and the Red Lake reservations. Bemidji is known as the first city of the Mississippi because it sits on Bemidji Lake, the northernmost lake feeding into the Mississippi River, and is said by some to be the birthplace of Paul Bunyan, the giant lumberjack and folk hero in American and Canadian folklore. The Ojibwe are part of a broader group of indigenous people. They're culturally related to the indigenous people of the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. According to Ojibwe oral history and recordings from birch bark scrolls, prior to first contact with Europeans, the Ojibwe originated from the mouth of the St. Lawrence River on the Atlantic coast of what is now Quebec. They traded widely across the continent through canoe routes. As the history goes, one of 7 great Mijis appeared in an area known as the Land of the Dawn to teach them a spiritual way of life. One of the Mijis, though, was said to be too spiritually powerful and killed the people in the Land of the Dawn. The 6 other Mijis remained to teach while the dangerous one returned to the ocean. The 6 remaining ones established clans that still exist today: the bullhead, the crane, the pintail duck, the bear, and little moose. The 6 Mijis are said to have returned then to the ocean. But one Miji eventually returned again at a later point in a vision to share a prophecy that said that if the people did not move further west, they would not be able to preserve the traditional ways because of a new pale-skinned set of settlers who had arrived from the east. The migration path gradually took the Ojibwe people along the St. Lawrence River to the Ottawa River, through lakes, and eventually to the Great Lakes. Eventually, they ended up in what we now call Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Others made it as far as the Pacific Northwest. The first historical contact between the Ojibwe and Europeans was with French Jesuits. Eventually, the Ojibwe were able to gain guns and European goods that allowed them to dominate their traditional rivals, including the Lakota and Fox tribes to their west and to the south. The Ojibwe drove the Sioux from the upper Midwest to where they are now in the Dakotas. By the end of the 18th century, the Ojibwe controlled nearly all of what is present-day Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, as well as the northern shores of Lake Huron and Lake Superior in Canada and the Turtle Mountains in North Dakota. Many peace and friendship treaties were made between the Ojibwe and Europeans, including later ones that had land concessions for cooperation and resources. Following this period, the Ojibwe aligned themselves with the French against the British and their colonists in the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. After fighting along with other native tribes against British rule, the Ojibwe then aligned themselves with the British against Americans in the War of 1812. After losing that war, the United States government began to forcibly remove the Ojibwe to west of the Mississippi River in Minnesota in an effort that ultimately failed, but separated and decimated and checkerboarded the people. Ojibwe people have a long history of social and political activism and have had a striking impact on Native and American culture, from cuisine to things like Dreamcatchers. In many ways, the Ojibwe are both a thriving and dying people. In some ways, their strong culture is flourishing and resurging, but in other ways, things like tribal blood quantum laws mean that fewer Ojibwe women can give birth to Ojibwe children who can be members of their tribe, even if they end up having children with other natives or other bands of the Ojibwe. Today, we're going to discuss Ojibwe culture and language, the many contributions to American society that the Ojibwe and other natives have made, many of the things that permeate today, like Dreamcatchers and Bigfoot, come from those histories and those traditions. But we're not only going to discuss the tragedies, the traumas, and the heartache. We're going to discuss some of the amazing successes that the Ojibwe people have had and lessons that all of us from a wide variety of cultures can learn from their experience. Coming on, as somebody who, I'm a Black American in many places. I've grown up. One of them was Georgia. And I remember even as a little kid first being exposed to indigenous cultures there. If you've ever spent time in that area where the Cherokee used to be in Georgia and Tennessee, there were lots of educational and cultural things at the time that I was growing up in, let's say, the early 80s and late 80s there. And I remember even as a little kid, as I would go to these places and I would learn, saying to my mom and dad, and my dad still remembers it, saying, where did all the people go? And, over time, growing up and taking an interest in indigenous culture, I began to sort of like expose myself as deeply as humanly possible to the indigenous experience in the United States. And it's really not one experience. It's many different experiences. And over time, I think I've taken an interest in, the culture, the related issues. And I think sometimes we focus a lot on the tragedies and we don't always focus on the rich ways of life and other things that enter culture. And then last year, my mother died in October of last year. And one of my friends who really stepped up to support me and help me was an Ojibwe woman from Minnesota. And one of the great things about being on the journey with her, she still lives on a reservation. Her family is still there. I think I learned even more, even though I'm a person who's very interested in these issues and cultures. I learned even more and learned that I learned how much I don't know and how many misconceptions I have. And I thought, you know, I've had many people on to another Ojibwe man, Monty Frank, up at Mille Lacs Band. I visited him over the summer. I had him on to talk about his daughter who went missing and murdered. But I also feel like there's a depth to the culture and the history that we don't always talk about. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you come on. And I'm really grateful for you for doing it.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be in conversation with you. I wanted to say sorry about the loss of your mom. That's something that changes your life forever. I lost mine a few years ago. And so my heart's with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you. There's nothing, it was not what I expected. And there's nothing really like it. It's hard. I imagine, the loneliness, but I also think there's a clarifying element to it about what's important in life. But one of the most interesting things for me about the loss of my mom is I think going through that experience has helped me understand other people's suffering in a deeper way and love them in a whole deeper way, if that makes sense.
Right. It totally does.
Sorry about your mom too.
Yeah. Thank you.
And it's kind of interesting because I think my mom's death and this friend stepping in the gap to be a good friend, I probably would not have learned and probably would have never met Monty and probably would have never gone up to the Mille Lacs Band's powwow over the summer. And so, I sort of look at that as another gift from my mom, right? This deep, rich learning that in tragedy, her loss, this gift that she gave me. So, I know in thinking about your family history, I know that one of the interesting things that I read is you were both the son of a Holocaust survivor and an Ojibwe woman. And, I think on its face, and I think about this too in my learning about your culture and about similar cultures, I keep on getting surprised at some of the similarities of our experience because, there are obvious similarities, but there are others that just seem so different. And I was talking to a Native woman in Alaska, and she was like, oh, yeah, they did the same thing with, poll voting and trying to prevent us from vote that they did to you all. But that of a Holocaust survivor and Ojibwe woman, I imagine those two cultures kind of you have two cultures that have experienced such hardships, really persecution, and demonstrated an enormous amount of strength and resilience. And I was just curious about how you think having both of those histories as a part of you impacted you, changed you, or helped you.
Oh, yeah. Certainly, I agree with the way you queued that question up. We are more than the sum of our tragedies. And although most Americans hear stories and maybe hear only stories about loss and tragedy, especially with the Native experience, that, we are so much more than that. That even when you look at the past 500 years, which has been full of genocides and mistreatments, that's not the only thing that has happened. Native people have not just been good at taking a hit, which I think sometimes gets celebrated a little too much too, but, have been good at reforging community and healing and capacity for addressing all of the things. In 1969, 57% of the native population lived below the poverty line. Today, 23% of the native population lives below the poverty line. And it does tell you two things. One of the things is that, well, if 23% of a population is below the poverty line, that's gross. That's an indictment on America and its oppressions, not native people and their lack of a work ethic. But it also means that we just shaved 34 entire percentage points off of indigenous poverty, not because of an external intervention. That's something native people engineered for themselves. So if you want to know something about how to disrupt systemic intergenerational poverty, ask indigenous people. They have the best track record for doing exactly that. And when you understand that, it can move you out of paternalism and pity, which people are often enculturated to use in approaching native folks, to one of partnership. How did they do that? How can we scale that up? How can we do that with other communities? And how can I learn more about that from them in addition to, what I know and can share too? So I think it's helpful when you get that perspective for, interrupting the Jesus complex.
I've never really heard it called the Jesus complex. The one of the things that you were saying that was a couple of things you were saying were really interesting, but one of them, that has really stuck out to me in my experience years ago. I think this is like 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. I read this book called Yellowbird. And one of the things that you learn in the book is about, what essentially happened in terms of forced relocation, when mineral rights were found on native reservations in Nebraska and all of these other impacts. But one of the things that they do that I actually think is one of the most powerful things in the entire book is at the end, they start talking about intergenerational trauma. And they talk about some of the research related to intergenerational trauma that Native scholars have done and the hidden impact. And I remember in reading about that, I started to just grab everything I could on it because I thought for African American culture and other cultures I've seen that have struggled, these are great lessons for us, great opportunities for us to grow. So that was one thing I was thinking of. And, you had made that point about looking at cultures through the lens of pity and the Jesus complex. What do you think the downside of doing? Is it the sort of paternalism gets in the way of you viewing people as equal, or?
Oh, I think there are multiple issues there. First of all, I don't know how many people listening, have been in a romantic relationship or a friendship where approaching their partner with paternalism and pity worked really well.
That's a very good point.
Right? So it will be off-putting, almost like you're looking down your nose at somebody like they're a child, to treat somebody that way. And it establishes a power dynamic and disposition that is going to, impede the development of healthy relationships and learning.
Because it essentially disempowers them. It subjugates them essentially again by saying, you need my help, you need my pity, as opposed to we could do this together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if somebody approaches me with paternalism and pity, I'm not necessarily going to think less of myself. I'm just going to think I don't want to talk to them. Right? Maybe some people will have a self-esteem impact, but also, the hubris of assuming that I've got all the answers and these other people have none, is really problematic. If you think about it, all of us humans, we all need healing. And, like the adage that hurt people. Is it any surprise that white men dominate the ranks of school shooters and serial killers? They need healing too.
I never thought of that.
And if you think about it, colonization, which is taking one language, culture, and religion and using it to supplant the others, it's about erasure. And often it has employed violence to orchestrate the erasure. But when you solve all your problems with violence, it makes a bunch of other problems. Now, what, right? Yeah. So now, why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems?
Yeah, right.
And they can't.
You're essentially recreating part of the challenge, because as you were talking, I was thinking to myself that, and I think this is a similar bond between Native and African American cultures, this idea that the white European settlers were going to turn us into proper people by teaching us Christianity and all of these different things, that while some of it may have been very well intentioned by some, right, others not, it did set up this kind of, I think, dangerous power dynamic. And my father's side of the family is from a county in South Carolina, right along the Georgia border, called Edgefield County. And it has a reputation. It's been known as Bloody Edgefield. And most people tie that back to sort of like the early pre-Civil War era and some of the violence that happened there. But scholars have gone back to before the American Revolution, when the Scots-Irish originally came over as, you know, sort of like less than or prisoners, and they employed violence within their communities. And then as slaves came, that violence was employed on them. And it followed the history of this one guy named Willie Bosket, who was in prison for life in prison in New York, all the way back generation to generation. And one of the things I walked away with that book, like, you know, his father could have been a lawyer. His grandfather could have been a doctor. Willie was really, really, really intelligent. But it made complete sense to me that alcoholism, abuse, and violence had just been bled into them as the only problem solving method. And so, to your point, like that definition of it, that line, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I think we have this tendency of doing that, like trying to use the same techniques that have created problems for us to solve the problems. And as you mentioned, school shooters and other things like that, I thought of that, but also the patriarchal approach, I think.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, one of the things I was also wondering about, for you, you lived in Leech Lake Reservation area your entire life in Minnesota?
Yep, still do.
Okay. And could you tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up there with your mom? I don't know if your dad was there with you too, but
oh yes. Yeah, you know, you'd asked about both of my folks and about Leech Lake, so I'm happy to share a little bit more about my family story. Both of my parents had very different experiences. My father was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. So he was born in Vienna, Austria. He lived in Austria the first 13 years of his life. He was still there after the German annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, in 1938. And then, you know, he had to run for it. He saw some pretty tough stuff. His mother was forced to scrub the streets at gunpoint with German soldiers, watched compulsory divorces between Jews and Christians, was chased around by Hitler Youth with knives trying to kill him, and had 300 family members killed in the camps. So he and his mother made it out to England. He ended up being at first put in a camp for children who were orphaned during the Spanish Civil War in England, and then later to a boarding school in Waterford, Ireland. His mom had to work on papers to get to the U.S. and money for a passage. And eventually she got them and they made it to the States. His father survived as well and made it out and joined them. And then He was 14 by the time they came to America. At age 17, signed up for the U.S. Army, and World War II was still going. I think he wanted to kill Nazis. But they sent him to the Pacific Theater. He was stationed in the Philippines. And he went through many life changes. I think afterwards he could just tolerate no oppression. So he ended up working as a labor union organizer, a teacher of English. He took jobs, including for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and made it to Minnesota. And that's where he met my mom, and I come from. And my mom had a very different experience. She lived her first 18 years on the Leech Lake Reservation. She's actually an enrolled member at White Earth. Her mother was enrolled at White Earth and her father at Leech Lake, but she was always resident at Leech Lake. And she, they would pull all the kids from school for 2 weeks at a time for wild rice harvesting, hunting, fishing, maple syrup production. All the kids had to help put food on the table. And there are 10,000 tribal members at Leech Lake. And although she lived her first 18 years entirely on the reservation, she only met one professional Native person her entire childhood. And that person was the school nurse.
Oh, wow.
And so that means out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one who would be, a teacher, a janitor, a police officer, a banker. And it wasn't because no one was capable of the jobs. And it wasn't because no one wanted the jobs. It's because even on a reservation, the systems were that oppressive and exclusive, excluding Native people from gainful employment. And so when she finished high school, she was looking around, looking at that one Native professional person she saw, the school nurse, and she thought, maybe I could do that. So she ended up going to nursing school and got a nursing degree. And one of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. She ended up going back to school and getting a law degree. She was actually the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. And so, when I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court and she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, I'd sit there and not say a word. And I can't remember her court cases very well, but I do remember things. And among the things I remember is that she was the only woman in court, and that she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only Natives in court. And I would come walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. And that's the D in the DEI, diversity, representation, role models. It makes such a powerful difference. Yeah. By the way, we just had the retirement celebration for Paul Day, my mom's former law partner. Mm-hmm. And they asked me to speak. And I had to tell him, I said, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing something professional. And we were in a room with about 300 people in there, most of whom were Native judges, lawyers, social workers, and educators. And I said, look how far we've come.
That's amazing.
And think how far we still have to go.
Yeah.
So, for me, looking at the experience of my parents, and my mom's mom had been brought to residential boarding school and forbidden to speak our language. And, there were plenty of horror stories on all sides. But, we are not beholden to our tragedies. I think both of my parents in different ways gave some pretty powerful examples of how to persevere, overcome, and push through those things. It doesn't mean that their experiences did not impact them, or that those of their parents did not impact them, or that there was no epigenetic imprint from the trauma. I think, there's a lot to talk about with the trauma stuff you were asking questions about, and I'm happy to share about it. But, it is not the only thing that happened. And, a certain amount of adversity is good.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're living life, and always skipping leg day. You know what I mean?
What do you mean by that?
What I mean is if you want to get strong, you go to the gym. and it does not feel good. And if you keep going, it starts to feel not quite as bad, and you can habituate to it, and then you're getting stronger. And if you're always skipping leg day, those muscles will atrophy. So if a child is always sheltered from having to figure anything out or have anything to worry about, if you don't give them an allowance and make them deal with the budget, then they just never develop the musculature for dealing with things.
Well, I guess it gets back to what we were talking about before. That's one of the ways, and I imagine for some people, some of it's inherent and some of it's personality, but those life experiences are part of how we build resilience. And I mean, that's one of the striking things. And I know that their traumas and tragedies are important, but I'll tell you, in the last year of my sort of experience with your people, the thing that has stuck out to me the most is not, like, we acknowledge the traumas and the tragedies, the checkerboarding, the forced boarding schools, all of these things. But actually, the resilience and the preservation of ways of life have been the thing. The resilience is what stuck out to me. Like, what a resilient people to go through all of this. And you were mentioning things like the, rice harvesting or the fishing or the preservation of the language. It just feels like I was sitting at Mille Lacs. They have a museum, the Ojibwe Museum, and I was reading the timeline. I was going through the timeline and thinking to myself, it is a miracle that not only that these people have survived, but it's a miracle that they preserve so much of that culture. And I'm so curious how you think that happened.
Well, it did not happen by accident or just because it should. I think, it took intentional action. And, there's so much to talk about here. First of all, I do think it's important to note with regard to the trauma piece that led into this is that a little bit of adversity is good for you. It helps you build muscle. Too much adversity is bad for you. It creates trauma. And trauma can have lasting impacts in a person's life and can even be passed on through generations. That's the epigenetic imprint of trauma. And those things are real. And, when you look at Native people today, we inherit both, all the stuff that happened from the trauma experiences, the negative stuff and the positive stuff, both the capacity for developing muscle to deal with adversity and, unnecessary and unwelcome triggers and unhealthy coping mechanisms. They're married to each other. They're two sides of a coin. And so,
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, I was going to just grab on to something that you had just said there about the intergenerational trauma and it being imprinted. I know a lot of people, when they hear words like that, they think, metaphorically, or that my mom and dad's experiences lead to the way they raised me, which passes it on. And that's all true. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating, and it was a Native researcher, Margaret Yellowhorse Braveheart, who's an expert in intergenerational trauma. She had been a part of research that showed literally it changes your DNA, and that literally is also passed down. And so I find, in hearing those words and combining it with life experience, it just makes me feel one of the challenges for all of us, all kinds of communities. How do we minimize the exposure to trauma that people experience? So it does not. I mean, because it must take generation and generation and generation to recover from traumas.
It can. So you got a couple of questions you've thrown at me, and I've got answers for you on both. So maybe since we're talking about trauma, I'll extend this part first, and then I'll come back to how did Mille Lacs and other places keep their culture going through it all. But with regard to trauma, first of all, if a person experiences trauma in their own life, like a small child who is being harmed, and it's hard for them to exercise their fight response because they're small. And it's hard for them to exercise their flight response because they're little and someone will bring them back. And so it can be very difficult if someone's in a real trauma experience where they shut down and have out-of-body experiences and all kinds of things. Now, as I mentioned, a little bit of stress is good. That's the kind that says, I'm going to get up in the morning and go to school. That level of stress is good. There's a kind that's tolerable that says, I'm going to grind this out and finish college, even though it's kind of tough for me right now. And that's tolerable. And then there are the kinds like trauma and excessive toxic stress that cause tremendous harm. It will manifest itself in predictable ways, even if someone has only 5 adverse childhood experiences. And maybe I shouldn't even use the word only. If a person has 5 adverse childhood experiences, it will replumb their brain. So the reactivity to the fight or flight response is much more sensitive. And as a result, predictably, those who've experienced trauma will demonstrate, either a emotionally reactive response or a spaced out and zoned out response.
Sort of the different styles of attachment almost.
It's like fight or flight, and it's also like, avoidant or, anxious attachment style. It shows up in many different things. And so it could be like, hey, Johnny, come in, it's time to take your test. What you coming at me like that for? Throw the chair. Or, hey, Johnny, come in, it's time to take your test. And it's like, huh? And you may get the same reaction from those 2 different reactions from the same person. They may ping pong between those things.
Yep.
That's what happens when someone experiences trauma. But what we've been learning is that it doesn't even have to be your trauma. It could be your grandma's. And it can be passed forward epigenetically on top of your DNA through the generations. And a lot of the studies are things like studies of twins, because you cannot ethically take 2 groups of humans and subject one to trauma. So you look at twins who are separated at birth and, had 2 totally different environments and what things are different, and try to isolate variables. And then there's studies of mice where if you put a electrode into the pain center of a mouse or rat's brain and give it a pain stimulus and introduce the smell of apple blossoms, it'll be scared of apple blossom smells for the rest of its life. But not only that rat, but the children of that rat and the grandchildren of that rat with no pain stimulus will still be scared of the smell of apple blossoms. It's not genetics, otherwise all rats would always be scared of apple blossoms. It's epigenetics. It comes from an environmental stimulus and gets passed forward. Now, when you look at humans, all of us, when you go far enough back in time, have an experience with trauma. We were all clunking each other over the head and stealing each other's bologna sandwich at some point in time. So for anybody, it can show up like, unexplained depression that comes out of nowhere, self-destructive behavior. That happens to anybody, even the most insulated, advantaged, and privileged person. But for some groups of people, it will show up, it'll pop up today more like popcorn. The Black experience with slavery, the Native experience with genocide and residential boarding schools. And so there's just more crap that you have to deal with. I would tell you, for me personally, my parents had plenty of trauma. My parents were getting started, and we had some, trials through adversity when I was a young person. But honestly, I did not suffer anything like what they did. But today, I notice for myself, and you could read or check out the YouTube videos by Gabor Mate, who's done a lot of research on this. And he says there is a link between addiction and trauma, and between ADHD and trauma. That ADHD, where you will see, highly distracted behavior or periods of hyper-focus, is really a flight and fight response. and that has its origins in trauma, not necessarily from the person who has ADHD, but it's in the family tree. And that for those in addiction, they are desperately seeking safety because of the trauma experience.
Yeah.
And objectively know that using and boozing is not going to make me safer, but numbing out and disassociating for a while gives the temporary feeling of safety. And so if we have this understanding, I see it like in my own life where, I'm certainly ADHD, and at times it serves me well, but with self-awareness, I can navigate. So like I am easily distracted and lost into my TikTok feed or whatever. And I have periods of hyper focus. And here comes another book by Anton Treuer, and I can navigate. Also, one of the profound things I thought that Gabor Mate shared was that we need to help people address the feeling of safety. Like if you have somebody, for example, dealing with alcohol addiction, they can heal to the point where they can walk into a bar and order a burger and not fall off the wagon. But they will get there by tending to safety. And safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection.
It's very interesting you say that. So as somebody I'm a recovering alcoholic, or recovering alcoholic and addict. And, for the longest time early in my sobriety, I could not go into a bar, period. It just wasn't. But
Yeah.
I had one friend who was just always kind to me, who was a bartender. And eventually I could go in to just that bar and order food. And what it really was I was in a safe place. And I know Mate, I'm familiar with a little bit of his research into mental health and autoimmune diseases and all sorts of different things that are connected. But his work on, I don't know if you've read his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts.
I have.
Yeah. And I found that notion and that interconnection to trauma really related, or was relatable to me, because there was no life experience for me. Well, maybe there were some, but there were none that I felt were so significant in my own life, a bit like yours. But then when I went and looked at my father's life, where, his nieces burned to death in a house that they lived in because of a stove, in the 60s. And then my grandfather's brother was lynched right across from them, and they had to run across the state. And then you go back to slavery. And you start to look at the long line of people who struggled with addiction for none of the normal sociological reasons we associate with it. It tends to lead some credence to this idea that it's trauma, but very much so trauma that's passed on. Not merely a coping skill being handed off from mom to dad, because it sounds, and maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like your parents cope very well with the traumas they faced.
I mean, that's a whole nother podcast.
Okay.
I am proud of my parents. I think they did some remarkable things coming through it. They certainly had demons to wrestle, in their lives as well. But this idea of connection, like, you could go into the bar because you had connection with the bartender and felt safe enough where you wouldn't be triggered into falling off the wagon. I think for anybody coping with those things, that's what to tend to. And it really brings me to this other question you're raising, like how have Native people made it through all of this horrible stuff and still have a culture? Well, it is the culture that provides the connection, and it's something that's highly prized, and in both practical, not just a philosophical sense. Like, Mille Lacs, which is a community where, you've spent a little time, and I spent a lot of time in Mille Lacs too. It's remarkable. The first ceremonial drum that was placed there, the drum chief, he had a death and lost his son. And he said, look, this is no good. These drums are no good. The people who brought us this drum are no good. I quit. And he got up to leave the ceremony.
Mm.
And the people stopped him from leaving. They grabbed him by the hand like you would a small child, and they walked him around back to his seat. And then they have this custom, like the ancient custom was people would rub charcoal on their faces when they were grieving. They wouldn't show excessive vanity by having tightly braided hair. And so what they did is they washed all the charcoal off of his face, and they combed out and rebraided his hair, and they piled up gifts and asked him to keep going with life and with the drum. And then they had their warriors stand up, 4 of them, and they each had a special song, and they danced around the drum, went up to him, and they wiped away his tears.
Oh, wow.
And then they sung a 5th song, and they lifted him up, and they brought him to dance around the drum into the circle, symbolic of going on with life.
Wow.
Now, today, we don't put charcoal in our faces or leave our hair unbraided when we've had a death in the family, but we replicate the ceremony, this wiping of the tears ceremony, every time when somebody's lost somebody. And so I went through this when each of my parents died, and they seated me back, took me by the hand and seated me at the drum, and they washed my face and combed my hair and piled up gifts and sang those songs and wiped the tears. And it provided a lot of healing for me and a strong sense of connection to the drum itself, to the songs that were used, to the other people in the room. And the only way to pay it back is to do that for other people. And so, it provides healing. It's not just a performative ceremony, like somebody died, now we have to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It does something. So for a community like Mille Lacs, they were an early adopter of casino gaming.
Mm-hmm.
They saved half their money from gaming, and now their endowment has eclipsed gaming as a revenue stream. They used monies to put a ceremonial dance hall for each of their ceremonial drums in all of the communities on the reservation. They put an elder in each of the classrooms. They put spiritual leaders in the clinic to provide traditional cultural remedies right alongside of the modern medical doctor. They funded the development of Rosetta Stone for teaching the Ojibwe language, and have been very thoughtful about supporting the things that provide culture and connection to their tribal members.
Yeah.
When you look at the citizenry there, the answer to the question, like, how do they keep the culture going? Well, they valued it because it has such lasting value. And they still had to do the things. And we have lost people and we have lost things. There are some tribes that lost their language entirely. That doesn't mean that they are less than or they don't care. Some tribes are dealing with, all kinds of colonization from the British or the Spanish or the Russians or the French before the Americans even came to do it to them all over again. So different places have different dynamics with, the efforts to erode their cultures. But, for those that have placed a high priority on language and culture, those things are paying tremendous dividends. Not just, I spoke about my experience dealing with my grief and loss when I had that experience through that particular ceremony. But, on most Saturday nights, when a lot of young people are looking for the next party, the ceremonial dance halls in Mille Lacs have hundreds of people there eating healthy food, getting up and doing physical activity, dancing, learning about their language and practicing their culture. And it is actually healthy. And it's a marvel to see.
And it goes back to that thing you were talking about it builds a connection, a powerful, just I imagine like the fishing that we were talking about, or the rice harvesting, or going to the Boundary Waters up in the north and canoeing with your family. All these things build connection. And one of the things that someone had said to me is that sense of connection in the community is what keeps you from getting involved in something like crime, or you have coping mechanisms that aren't, just the traditional ones. And not to say that people won't fall even if they have into negative things, but it gives you other ways out. It plants seeds and options. I remember taking a look at the Fond du Lac Reservation, which is closer to Duluth, and just being amazed by things like their healthcare system that they had built. That's better than a lot of rural communities that I see. And I just wonder why we don't hear these stories, why you think in the broader population, we don't hear these stories of success.
Well, I do think that is starting to change. And I think the answers are multifold. First of all, it's just how people are conditioned. Like 87% of educational standards that even mention Native people are things from before 1900.
Oh, wow. So
right?
Before natives could even vote in the United States,
Before they're citizens and stuff like that. So a lot of in our educational systems, they're like, we're going to give 1% of the bandwidth to Native stuff. So it's like natives, that's who's here before. Okay, now we're going to talk about fur traders, or it's Christopher Columbus or the first Thanksgiving,
Right.
that's about all they do. So that conditions people. If you look at the movies, there are more movies about aliens than Native Americans. So people are left to their imaginings. And, in some places like the American Southwest or certain parts of the Great Lakes, Native people might have a more visible presence, but in much of America, we do not. And so some people, I've even had people say it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I said, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh yeah, that's right. It just not even on the consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing. I think another thing is that who is delivering the information that people are using to form their opinions and understandings. And most of the information that most people get about natives is coming from non-native people. And that is starting to change. We got reservation dogs now on TV, and we got lots of Native people starting to write books, and it's starting to shift, but it's an evolving dynamic rather than a thoroughly seasoned practice. And, of course we need to amplify that and have much more of that. And, even something like having a Native dude on the podcast is a positive step, in those directions. So more of it, please. But at the same time, you often have the imagined Indian. It's like if you wanted to understand the Catholic Church, but you only read the writings of Muslim people about the Catholic Church, well, you'd be getting a perspective, and maybe some are really fair and balanced and understood a lot, but wouldn't you want it from the source?
Yes.
And so with Native stuff, why all the white authored books with Native characters are the New York Times bestsellers and a lot of the other stuff isn't, it is still strange to me. So it's,
It was even fascinating for me as I started to, research about, the Cherokee around where I grew up in Georgia, that's pre-Amazon. But, going to the bookstores or even looking in the book catalogs, it was all books written by people who were white. And, even when I was looking for books on Ojibwe culture, it took me literally going to Mille Lacs Trading Post to actually find one that was in stock. And I thought, wow, this is it's a bit of a travesty. And which kind of ties back to another thing I wanted to ask you about your journey into academia. How did you left Minnesota? I know you were, you went to school, I think in Wisconsin, made the decision to come back to the University of Minnesota, then up to Leech Lake again. How did you decide to go into academia, and then how did you decide to focus in this area?
Yeah, well, I had finished high school with the plan that a lot of high schoolers have, and my plan was to get out of town and never come back. I thought, among other things, that there was an escape from the brambled racial borderland of my youth, and that it would be so much better, and that was very naive. I got into Princeton University, and the first person I met there said, "Oh, dude, are you native? Where's your tomahawk?" And I remember thinking, "Oh no, the brambled racial borderland will follow me everywhere I go, and these are the dumbest smart people I've ever met." And
Right.
I ended up having a great experience there, and my friends that I made there are lifelong. But I finished college with the plan, the exact opposite of my high school plan. I said, I'm going to come home and never leave. And in the long run, that is kind of what I did. I told my parents I'm going to hang out with my elders and, spend time at ceremonies, and I'm not going to take a job or go to grad school. And they said, "Oh, that's beautiful. Good luck paying for that because we're done." And I did it anyways. And I ended up hanging out. Spent a lot of time with this gentleman named Archie Mose, and he could barely speak English. He was 12 years old the first time he ever saw a white man. That was an American experience. And he was watching WWF SmackDown on a TV in a modern house when I came to see him. But he shut off the TV and he said, "Oh, I've been waiting for you." I said, "Waiting for me? You don't even know who I am." Because he really didn't know me. But he had had a dream about someone, and I looked like this person in his dream. And for him, that was enough. He said, "Sleep on the couch." And then at about 5 a.m, he's standing over the couch saying, "Hey, get up. You got to drive me to a funeral." I said, "Funeral?" And I kind of became his gopher. Go for this, go for that, drive me here, drive me there. And I kept that up for quite a while. I did eventually have to take a job, and I did decide to go to graduate school. And I actually got a PhD in history and started recording Archie, telling stories in Ojibwe and translating and transcribing and doing oral history. I had to fight my way through academia too. My assigned academic advisor said, "I don't know if you should study Native people at all." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, because you're Native and you'll have bias." And I said, is this coming from a white man who wrote 20 books about white men?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I won my battle, but I had to make it a battle, and ended up kind of morphing in my career.
You just honed in on a super interesting point about academia or journalism or any other field, and using the Native example, but I think it's probably true for African Americans and any other groups. As a former journalist, when I had to cover an issue, and I can think about this during the sort of post Million Man March, if you know that Louis Farrakhan kind of age, after that in the early 2000s and the late 1990s, there was this emergence of this, what I would say, somewhat hateful, but also tight community called the New Black Panther Party. And they were causing trouble, and they were going to do a march also in New York City. And, a guy named Khalid Muhammad, who unfortunately passed away probably too soon, was the leader of it. And it was very interesting to me I was assigned to cover it, and there was skepticism. I was working at the New York Times at the time, and there was skepticism among my white editors whether I could be unbiased about it. And there was skepticism among the New Black Panther people that I was Black and I worked for the New York Times. But I always thought it was kind of odd. Nobody looks at a white person and says, "Well, you might be biased, or what? Maybe you shouldn't cover Wall Street." It's just it's baffling to me.
Well, it's not baffling to me. It's just the anatomy of the racial caste system that America's employed for its entire existence. And it's if you want to, I see this in my own academic career. If you want to be in a position, be a professor of Indigenous studies, you can't do that just by being a fluent speaker who's lived your culture your entire life. You can only do that if you are credentialed in a colonial institution.
Right. You have to go to...
So you have to go to a PhD program. You have to read, hundreds and hundreds of books by white folk and be an expert on that stuff, and have most of your teachers and instruction be non-native people, mainly white folk, and once you've jumped through all of those hoops, then you can apply for the position, And it's like, if you want to be a K-12 educator at a school on a reservation with 100% of the kids being Native kids, you can't do that if you live in the community, speak the language, know the culture, and know the families and kids well. That'll hurt you. You can do that if you have a K-12 educator's license. And a white person with a K-12 educator's license who doesn't know anything about the culture or the community or the language or the whatever has all the authority to come in there, even though they might have a complete disconnect from all of the kids they're trying to teach. That's how those systems work. And, even having Native preference in the hiring at a school on a reservation has been something people have had to fight for.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that sort of like brings to mind for me is thinking about this idea of advocacy, right? As somebody who is non-Native, I have picked up on this trend that's very fascinating. So when my friends who are Native are advocating for Natives, I see other people's eyes gloss over as soon as they realize they're Native. But if I'm advocating, right, because people perceive it's not in my self-interest, right? If I'm advocating, they listen. And so I'm curious, and it might just be that sometimes I'm very persuasive, but I'm just curious, what is our role? You think those of us who are not natives, what do you think our role is in having a positive impact on Native communities?
Well, there are multiple roles, and we need people in all of them. So I do think that there are parallels in, all of the isms, the sexism, the racism, all of the fault lines for oppression, in that, who's representing in which ways matters, right? Like the all male gender equity team is going to be missing some vital perspectives and the optics aren't so good.
Mm-hmm.
The all white racial equity team, same problems. And sometimes, like, I think most people will laugh if you say the all male gender equity team because it sounds so ridiculous. But then when you say the all white racial equity team, people start going, wait, what's he going to say now?
Well, it exists.
Because that's what's out there, right? Like, I mean, there was a big hiring of DEI specialists after the murder of George Floyd. And then they retracted most of them in the subsequent years.
Mm-hmm.
And today, 76% of the racial equity DEI positions are staffed by white people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so it's like, it erodes the whole fabric of that. So directly to the question, like, what do we do? Some of the work does need to happen in mixed company, and some of the work needs to happen in affinity space. And we need to lean into both of those and have awareness of what contexts are going to advance what parts of the work the best. So, for example, if, the white uncle is going off about natives at Thanksgiving dinner, me going into his house and confronting him about his attitudes is going to be less effective.
Right.
What is more effective is if their beloved niece says, Uncle, it's bothering me to hear you say this, and here's why. Because she has racial affinity space and can listen. So even an anti-racist white educator like Tim Wise has a role because he can be the white whisperer for those, who need it filtered that way.
I remember this one time.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. This strikes me. I remember this one time I had made a comment in a group chat about Bigfoot. I don't know what it was. It was some kind of joke, right? And I was really impressed because one of my Native friends who was in the chat had the courage in the chat in front of everyone to say, hey, could you not say that because it offends me, because what you're calling Bigfoot is a very important part of our origin story and our culture. And, she messaged me separately and she was like, I didn't want to offend you or bother you in front of people. I was like, no, this is great because you're empowering me to learn new information and more information. And not a week later, in a Facebook group, people were doing something very similar, but it was even more sort of like nasty. And it really empowered me to say to that group of people, as they all know I'm the black guy, right? They know I'm not native. Hey guys, I think this might be bothersome to people. It makes me uncomfortable for you to talk about that. And I just thought, like, what kind of spiritual heaven caused me to make that mistake, caused me to be lucky enough to have a friend who would educate me, and then empowered me to be helpful in an arena where their voice may not have been heard.
Right, right. And I mean, I've done some of my best growth when I've open mouth, insert foot, stumbled,
Absolutely.
bumbled, rumbled, messed it up, or whatever. And I think a lot of us, like, disturbance creates opportunity for growth, but dealing with racism, sexism, all these things, it's complex and nuanced. Some of it does need to happen in affinity space. Some of it needs to happen in mixed company. And then we have to always be mindful of power dynamics. So sometimes the best thing a man can do in addressing sexism when somebody hands him the microphone is, instead of mansplaining the whole dang problem, is to hand the microphone to a woman, And sometimes the best thing a white ally can do when someone's handing them the microphone and saying, help me understand better what's going on in native space, is to take the microphone and hand it to a native person. When we are coaching each other, things are situational and context derived. So, in the context of the chat situation where the same thing came up a week after you just got a lesson about it, it's awesome. Lean in and do your part, and that provides a learning opportunity for everybody else. And in other contexts, I've been asked to speak on something before where I had to say, look, I believe strongly in this issue. I want to support on this issue. If you need me in a certain way, I'm willing to show up, but I would advise you to have somebody who is from that community speak to this particular issue. And they're like, oh, crap. I'm really glad you said that,
Right. Right.
And I mean, I was leaving money on the table and everything, but it was the right thing to do. And so, I think, I get frustrated sometimes, like in the literature field, where they're like white authors looking for something cool and niche so that they can sell books.
Yeah.
And pick up on some native cultural theme, and it's like, you're not trying, you're trying to advance your agenda and money and position. And you're saying, I know somebody needs to speak on this microphone to this issue. It's going to be me.
Yeah.
As opposed to, somebody needs to speak on this issue. Please pay attention to this distinguished, native advocate on MMIW. Here's their YouTube channel. Here's their book. Here's the whatever, And so it takes strength to do that.
You can use your power to make the argument for somebody else to have a seat at the table.
Right. And so it's, it's all context, right? If it's just white folk hanging out at the Thanksgiving dinner, please speak up when your uncle goes off. If it's, a mixed company thing and there aren't native people there, please. I mean, we need to raise attention to the issues, and we need people to lean in rather than lean out, because a lot of the work does happen in mixed company, and we need to coach each other and develop awareness of all the things. Like, a lot of times people of color feel like disengaging because we're so frustrated.
You get tired of it.
Exhausted having to say the same thing over and over again, or go so slow so we have to tippy-toe around the white fragility and don't hurt anybody's feelings so that they don't run away. And really, like, how slow should we go when we don't get to live as long as everybody else?
It's a very interesting thing for me that, like in dealing with other cultures, sometimes I feel uncomfortable even taking people's time to answer my questions, because I'm like, this must be so frustrating or hard. And I'm so grateful for the people who do.
Yep.
One of the, in the Black American experience, there's something, lots of parallels, but one difference I see sort of post colonization, post slavery beginning here after first contact. For Black Americans during slavery, there was a use for us. They needed us. It's horrible. They needed us as chattel slaves. They needed a system in the South to have labor. But I feel as if, at least in my reading of the history, there became a point with natives in the United States where white America, or even beyond white colonists, no longer viewed there being a need, and it became about assimilation, which also became about eradication of culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some element of that in Black culture today. But, one of the things when I was at Mille Lacs, one of the things that really moved me that I didn't expect to move me was I looked at the map of what what might be considered the Minnesota Chippewa or the Chippewa and Ojibwe, showing their lands all over Minnesota, Wisconsin, into the mountains a little bit, into North Dakota. And then I saw beside it a map of the reservations and tribal lands, which aren't necessarily a part of the reservations now.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, when I looked at all these different reservations, White Earth on one side and Fond du Lac on the other side, and I think there's another one to the north, and there are tribal lands and it looks like a bunch of dots on the map. And, I had been at Mille Lacs, and, I looked at the license plates in the parking lot at one point, and there were ones from almost all the Minnesota Chippewa. There were some from out of state there. And I just thought to myself, how has this group of people survived when they have so intentionally been and deliberately broken? Are there things that can be done to help tie the culture back together with things like we're talking about, the language, the ways of life?
Yes. I mean, first of all, I would say all the things matter. And I believe in those things. And that's why I've devoted my life to teaching the Ojibwe language. And I kind of sit on a three-legged stool. One of the legs is what we've been talking about. I'm a professor. I teach our language. I write books. Another leg is I officiate at ceremonies, and that's, naming ceremonies for little babies and funerals for people who've passed on. I'm on 4 ceremonial drums. All of that work is uncompensated and just in the traditions of our people, but it's about a third of my time. And I also do all this DEI work, and that takes me traveling all over the place. So they're like 3 strands of a braid. They feed one another, and there are many things we can do to stabilize and advance Indigenous languages and cultures, but all of them take time, attention, resources, and so forth. So and there are internal debates about best strategies. That too is probably a whole separate podcast, but it's hard even for the Amish to go Amish,
right?
To try to freeze a culture, language, and community in time, because even the Amish have to pay taxes in America or somebody takes their farm, So you still have to be integrated with the system, and they still lose people every year. It's difficult. And so if you're not going to try to go Amish, so to speak, then you have to get the modern world aligned with your language and culture. So examples of that would include development of Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe, which enables, Mille Lacs to, give it for free on an app on a smartphone to every single tribal member, and to tell all of the native and non-native people who take jobs to work in Mille Lacs, congratulations, working for our sovereign nation is a privilege. As in return, we expect you to demonstrate this level of competency in the tribal language. Here's the tool to do it. The assessments are built right in. You have 1 year from date of hire. And so language revitalization also feeds sovereignty and other things. So that is a step, but it's not a silver bullet. They've been very intentional about supporting their ceremonial drums with facilities, and everything else. And they even provide hotel rooms for visiting guests so that it's not as much of a burden for those who spend a lot of money just even driving there to support the drums. And they have great attendance at their ceremonies. There are many, many other things. There are lists, again, it would take hours to try to exhaust them. And we have whole conferences devoted to how should we strategize these sorts of things. And some of the, ceremonial things, that's from kind of wigwam culture, 6-hour-long legends and 2-week-long ceremonies and things like that. And so, some of that stuff doesn't fit into, the technological support from Rosetta Stone or something like that. So we have to make decisions about where and how we spend our time. So I spend 6 weeks of my summer in a wigwam doing ceremonies. And I also help bring Rosetta Stone into the world. And I also write books and talk on podcasts. And I also take my children hunting every year. And we also process maple sap into syrup and sugar every year. And they know the art, the science, and the culture of how to get food from a tree. And I think there's a value to doing all of those things.
Right. And the wigwams are the sort of they look like domes, and they're the dwellings that people use. And so you spend 6 weeks there each year working on.
Yep.
Wow, that's so cool on language. I was going to ask you one thing about culture. You had mentioned the white authors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it happens in all sorts of different things. It happens in podcasts, it happens in authors, it happens in all sorts of other space. And they grab onto this thing that's trendy. And, this is something I personally have a conflict about. And that's like appropriation to some extent. And I think you kind of lit something in my head because as I heard finally the story of the Spider Woman and the Dreamcatcher, was taught how to use it and other things along those lines. And that's something that has become a part of my life. I sit in a room right now. I don't tell people when I'm on video, but 2 paintings from an Ojibwe artist, Carl Gaboy, 2 of these watercolors are behind me. And one of them is an Ojibwe couple who are sleeping in their bed, rocking their baby in one of the traditional rockers by the window. And these things, like spiritually, have become a part of my life. And I was thinking to myself, like, how comfortable am I as someone who's not Ojibwe, not Native, incorporating? And it's something you said dawned on me that made me feel somewhat better about it. I'm not using it to send a message to anyone else. I'm not trying to appropriate it. It truly feels culturally impactful for me, and it's this private thing, right? But I wonder how we identify or see the difference between something like the private, because for me, the reason why I incorporate those things into my spiritual journey, to my aesthetic journey, is because they're personally impactful for me. I'm not trying to virtue signal to anyone. I'm not trying to, you know what I mean? How do we know the difference or the line? How do we know that podcaster who's white, who wants to work on missing and murdered Indigenous women, or that author who wants to write something about, history? Where's the line for you?
Well, the line is in this big gray area, and different people are going to put it in different places. Right. For me, as a general rule, if your experience is Native-led, it's pretty safe.
Right.
And if your experience is Native-inspired, you're on thinner ice. For example, if a Native person is inviting you to come to the powwow, go. It is Native-led. It's Native people sharing their culture. Cultural sharing is good. If a Native person has created artwork and is selling it, go ahead and buy the artwork. A Native person created that and wants it in the world, and they set the terms that they want it into the world. That is fine. If a Native person opens up a restaurant and says, come eat at Owamni, then by all means, go right ahead if you can get a reservation, because, that is a Native person sharing their stuff. Cool. Native led is pretty safe. Native inspired is on thinner ice. So that's, the Boy Scouts, doing Order of the Arrow, put on fake war paint and give fake Native names. Or, summer camp doing pretend sweat lodge ceremony and giving out Kentucky Fried Movie sounding Native names in English.
Right.
Thinner ice. In between is a gray area, and it is not super easy to know where and how to handle it. I can give some examples of things that I thought were crap or some things that I thought were good. There's a white guy named John Nichols who has a PhD in linguistics and has studied the Ojibwe language. And I think he is super cool. He is very careful about how he positions himself. He defers to Native leadership when it comes to pulling people together. He has refused to keep any royalties. He passes them on to the family of Maud Keg, who was his primary, Native informant for the dictionary, and has not financially bettered himself through his efforts. He loves the Ojibwe language. Somebody gave him a Native name. He's respected and referred to as an uncle and things like that. But he is careful not to take the mic from Native people and to support other Native people who are doing good things and not to make it all about him. And so he does a good job of navigating that space. I think, there are some other folks who and by the way, it's okay for people to have something that has to do with something that's not you in your writing. Otherwise, only men could write about men, only women could write about women. And, how the heck would you ever have a book? Because the world's full of both. And, so there has to be some allowance for some of that. But if a man is to write the book that's all about the liberation of women, I would say, why is he stealing the mic?
Right.
And you know what I mean? And if a white,
because you could be uplifting a woman to do that, or you could get out of the way for a woman to do it. You know what I mean? There are things you could do that would be positive and beneficial without stealing the microphone.
Right. And for those who want to make money, authenticity sells. If you're telling your story, that is compelling. If you are telling somebody else's story, why are you doing that?
Right. I'm curious for you, where is your work headed? What's the next chapter or next book, I guess?
Oh, I usually don't talk about the projects until I've got them off to the press. But you can expect plenty more from me. I will be writing both fiction and nonfiction.
Oh, neat.
The latest book is a work of fiction called Where Wolves Don't Die, and it's off to a great start. It's a YA thriller and tender coming of age story. But I have more nonfiction that I want to work on too, and stay tuned. I'm on all the social media platforms, have an active website, events pages, and stuff like that. Love to stay in touch with everybody who's tuning in.
Oh yeah, I'll definitely give a link to those in the show notes, and I think I might pick up your book for my niece. She has fallen into YA recently. I wanted to go ahead and just sort of close by asking you kind of what your sort of hopes are, your dreams are for the future. Particularly when it comes to the Ojibwe and the Native experience, or even if you want to speak more broadly to that. But I thought another piece that I'm just curious about is, what would your message be to Native women and men, particularly younger ones, about traveling in this world?
Oh, well, I have a great many hopes and dreams. I think in many ways, the language and culture revitalization work I've devoted my life to, and the diversity, equity, and inclusion work I've devoted my life to, those sorts of efforts are feeding a broad dream of healing some of the greatest hurts that humans have visited upon one another. And I believe it is possible for us to obtain healing as individuals, communities, societies, and even nations. But it's going to take all of our collective effort to get there. As far as a message to Native people traveling in this world is a beautiful place. It's got dangerous parts too. But I think that travel, learning, reading, they are inimical to all of the oppressions that are out there. And I encourage people to do it. You learn so much from all the people that you bump into and all the learning opportunities that you get. Take advantage of every one of them. And it will not just help you see the world differently, it will transform you. And the transformation will be worth all the effort.
That's great. Anton, this is a powerful conversation for me. I have to close by saying Miigwech, and we'll let the listeners look it up and figure out what I mean by that. But I really appreciate it. I feel like it's every time someone like you crosses my path, it is an absolute blessing. And it's truly eye-opening. And I'm glad you ended with that message because, I can't tell you the demographics of my listeners, but I do know they come from all spaces in life. And I wanted this conversation not to be just for whites or blacks or other people looking in, but I also wanted it to be for the natives, for the Ojibwe, for the Lakota, any tribe listening into it. And so I think that's just a powerful way to end it. So,
yeah. Thank you so much, Miigwech, my friend. I look forward to staying in touch with you and all of the people who are tuning into your show.
Yep. And I will be back in Minnesota in December. So if you're around the first week of December, maybe we could have a cup of coffee or something.
That would be great.
All right. Thanks, Anton.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed our conversation with Anton. I always love these culturally rich discussions. They're a blessing for me, not just as a learning experience, but just as a human being to grow even deeper. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook. Joining Patreon only costs $3 a month, and it helps support the podcast. It also gets you ad-free early episodes and special bonus episodes. Either way, whether you join Facebook or you come on Patreon, I'm looking forward to having you as another member of our community.